Well, hello, this is Paul Douglas, and I'd like to welcome you back to A Letter to an Apostle. Today we begin with the heart of the matter, as Sean McCraney would say, with interrogatory number 1, which is why is there an absence of archaeological or anthropological evidence supporting the Book of Mormon? To me, this is the most critical and troubling issue, and for that reason I've tried to come at it from every angle. It would seem to me that every legitimate non-Mormon anthropologist or archaeologist, and even the odd brave Mormon archaeologist, have indicated that there's nothing whatever to support the existence of the civilizations presented in the Book of Mormon. Is it reasonable to conclude that during the 2600 years that the Jaredites, Nephites, or Lamanites supposedly occupied the Americas, that they could have done so without leaving some evidence of their existence? Yet the reality is that they did not leave so much as a helmet, or a tool, or a weapon of war, or any Hebrew or Reformed Egyptian inscriptions. In Ether 15:2, we're told that 2 million men, women, and children died in battle, and I'm quoting, "He saw that there had been slain by the sword already nearly 2 million of his people, and he began to sorrow in his heart. Yea, they had been slain by 2 million of mighty men, and also their wives and their children." 2 million killed, and that's just on one side. Just to put this hyperbolic number in some kind of perspective, during the entire Civil War, 620,000 men were killed over 4 years. During all of the Second World War, America suffered 418,500 civilian and military deaths. On June the 6th, 1944, D-Day, one of the greatest battles of the Second World War, the first U.S. Army saw 1,465 men killed, 1,928 missing, and 6,603 wounded. The U.S. 7th Corps showed 22,119 casualties, including 2,811 men killed. Canadian forces at Juno Beach sustained 946 casualties, of which 335 were killed. While no British figures have been published, it's estimated that they run to somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 killed or wounded. It's also estimated as well, President Uchtdorf, that 4,000 to 9,000 of your fellow Germans died in battle that day. But D-Day pales compared to the tale Joseph Smith weaves of millions perishing in a single battle. That's approximately 100 D-Days, and if it had happened, it would have been the bloodiest battle in the history of the earth. If you spend a day beachcombing the shores of Normandy, Omaha, Utah, and Juno beaches and their environs, you'll surely find a bullet casing, a chin strap, or something else. In contrast, no swords or shields, no armor or helmets, boots, chariots, or other artifacts, vestiges or remains have ever been uncovered from this or any other great Book of Mormon battle. More than 3 times as many people perished that did in the Civil War in a much shorter time and within a smaller geographical area, and yet absolutely nothing. Zilch, zero, zip, nada has been found. The Book of Mormon talks about large cities and fortresses in all quarters of the land, many of these mighty cities encircled with moats and trenches. Where can we find the evidence of these? The Book of Mormon talks about a Nephite temple patterned after the great temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, a structure that took 7 years and 180,000 men to build. Where can we find evidence of this exceedingly fine structure? The Book of Mormon talks about the cities of Jacob-Ugath, Laman, Gosh, Gad, Kishiman, and Zarahemla. It talks about mature civilizations. Yet in the Holy Land, we find cities, historical sites, artifacts, weapons, coins, and much, much more. We've uncovered hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lamps and coins and everyday items dating to biblical times. So plentiful are they that I have several of these in my own home. Here are a few examples of the more significant finds. The existence of the Hittites. You'll recall in Genesis 23 that Abraham buried Sarah at the cave of Machpelah, which he purchased from Ephron the Hittite. The Mobite stone, a 3-foot stone slab referenced in 2 Kings, commemorated in hieroglyphic wall carvings at the Temple of Ammon at Thebes, spoken of in 1 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 12. The burial plaque of King Uzziah, discovered on the Mount of Olives, which reads, "Here the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, were brought." The Sennacherib prism, this cuneiform on a hexagonal 15-inch baked clay prism, found at the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, describes Sennacherib's invasion of Judah in 701 BC, in which it claims that the Assyrian king shut Hezekiah inside Jerusalem like a caged bird. The prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah that God would protect Judah and Jerusalem against Sennacherib. There have also been many biblical cities attested to archaeologically, including Jericho, Haran, Hazor, and Dan. As I write this, it's been 187 years since Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon, and 526 years since the discovery and European colonization of the Americas. The Mormon Church has expended millions of dollars searching for something, anything, to collaborate or affirm the Book of Mormon narrative, but they've come up empty-handed. Even BYU professor and LDS apologist D. Green had to confess, and I'm quoting, "No Book of Mormon location is known regarding modern topography." He continues, "The first myth we need to eliminate is that the Book of Mormon archaeologically exists. Titles on books full of archaeological half-truths, dilettantes on the peripheries of American archaeology calling themselves Book of Mormon archaeologists regardless of their education, and a Department of Anthropology at BYU devoted to the production of Book of Mormon archaeologists do not ensure that the Book of Mormon archaeologically really exists." Dr. Ray Metheny, another professor of anthropology at BYU, said in an address to the 6th Annual Sunstone Theological Symposium in August of 1984, "It appears that the Book of Mormon has no place in the New World whatsoever. It just doesn't seem to fit anything in anthropology or in history." These are individuals on the BYU payroll and ostensibly faithful members of the church to still be teaching there. I recently spent several months in the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territory. In all of these lands, when any archaeological lead is uncovered that suggests the possibility of buried antiquities, excavation follows. Megiddo, Shechem, Samaria, Shiloh, Geshira, Gibeah, Beth Shemesh, Bethshean, Beersheba, and many others have been excavated. I could go on, but I think the point has been made that there is considerable archaeological evidence supporting the Holy Bible. In contrast, the Book of Mormon has nothing to support it. Not an inscription, not a temple, not a house, not a sword, not as much as one of the coins that Smith alludes to in Alma 11, that Mormon apologists now claim were not coins, the chapter heading describing them as such notwithstanding. While a few early 20th century Mormon scholars have pointed to some archaeological findings consistent with the Book of Mormon story, mostly relating to Mayan, Inca, or Olmec ruins, every non-Mormon archaeologist that's examined these discoveries has discounted their veracity. The Mormon Church can be accused of misleading people by reproducing pictures of Mayan temples and printing them in their manuals and periodicals, as if they had something to do with the Book of Mormon peoples. However, it's a well-settled fact among legitimate archaeologists that the Mayans had absolutely no nexus with either Hebrew or Christian language, traditions, or beliefs. They were a pagan people who practiced human sacrifice. The Mayans were not Nephites, nor were they Lamanites. More often than not, as the following references will attest, leading unbiased, that is, non-Mormon archaeologists and anthropologists, as well as historians, maintain that the Book of Mormon is a somewhat poorly written and highly plagiarized work of 19th century fiction, and certainly not an authentic history of real people who lived somewhere in North, South, or Central America. They argue that millions of chariot-driving, Christ-worshipping, steel-smelting, horse-riding, wheel-using people occupying the Americas for more than 2,000 years could not possibly have done so without leaving some trace of their existence. Stephen J. Danderson writes in an article found on the FAIR site entitled adding up the Book of Mormon peoples, and I quote, "It's somewhat plausible that more than 7 million people were alive at the time of Jesus Christ's mortal ministry. Even assuming that only a tithe of survivors, that's more than 700,000, of the catastrophes described in 3 Nephi 8-11, a population of up to 100 million in AD 350 is not beyond reason. This figure is more than sufficient to sustain the hundreds of thousands of Nephites or who died during the Battle of Cumorah. At the time of the Doomsday Book, which was written in 1088 of the current era, England had a population of 2 million people. Could these Brits have occupied the land that they did for almost 1,000 years and not leave a shred of evidence of their presence? Can anyone with a head on their shoulders, no matter how strong their testimony, believe that this is remotely possible? Anyone who's visited this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, as the eternal bard has penned, has seen bountiful evidence of Britain's medieval cities, her churches, the ruins of her castles, bridges and fortifications, as well as millions of tools and weapons of war. Their art, literature, and language that informed this civilization is bountiful. We know who was on their thrones. We have uncovered copious evidence of their wars and battles. In contrast, the evidence of the Nephites and Lamanites is non-existent. One must ask why the Mormon Church has never attempted any excavation of the hill Cumorah, the site where Joseph Smith and his cohorts claim to have seen caves full of artifacts. Is it that the Church fears what they won't find, what they won't unearth, because once that bell has been rung, it can't be unrung? Is it as Dr. Thomas Murphy, an archaeologist and Mormon of record, has said, the Book of Mormon is a piece of 19th century fiction, and that we have to acknowledge that sometimes Joseph Smith lied? In contrast to the dearth of any archaeological findings supporting the Book of Mormon, more than 25,000 significant separate concrete evidentiary indicators supporting the Holy Bible have been unearthed. These discoveries include biblical empires. No matter how comforting the assurances of one's leaders, do we not have to use the gift of intelligence that the good Lord has given us? Take courage if you need it from the few Mormon archaeologists that have dared to tell the truth, and I'm quoting. What I would say to you is that there's no archaeological proof of the Book of Mormon. You can look all you want, and there's a lot of speculation about it. There have been books written by Mormon scholars saying that this event took place here, or that event took place there, but that's entirely speculative. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence that you can tie directly to the events that took place. Herewith is a copy of my recent paper on Book of Mormon geography. My thesis is that the Book of Mormon geography involves a lot more than playing with topography and terrain. The real implication of the paper is that you can't set Book of Mormon geography down anywhere because it's fictional and will never meet the requirements of dirt archaeology. I should say, what is in the ground will never conform to what is in the book. The above quote was from Thomas Stuart Ferguson, a faithful member of the church who, although not a professional archaeologist, as the church apologists are quick to assert, was nevertheless the recipient of a grant of more than $100,000 from the Mormon Church to carry on archaeological research. Non-Mormon archaeologists, of course, go much further, and I'm quoting, "So far as it is known to the writer, no non-Mormon archaeologist at present is using the Book of Mormon as a guide in archaeological research, nor do any non-Mormon archaeologists hold that the American Indians are descendants of the Jews, or that Christianity was known in America in the first century of our era. Let me now state uncategorically that as far as I know, there is not one professionally trained archaeologist who is not a Mormon who sees any scientific justification for believing the foregoing is true. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever shown up in any New World excavation that would suggest to a dispassionate observer that the Book of Mormon is a historical document relating to the history of early migrants to our hemisphere. I'm old enough to remember back in the 1980s hearing within church circles that the prestigious Smithsonian Institution was using the Book of Mormon as a guide in its leading archaeological research. This rumor was eventually brought to the attention of Smithsonian directors who, in 1996, felt they had to send a formal letter to inquiring minds stating that the Smithsonian certainly did not use the Book of Mormon to guide any research, and included a list of specific reasons why from Smithsonian archaeologists. And I'm quoting them: "The Smithsonian Institution has never used the Book of Mormon in any way as a scientific guide. Smithsonian archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of that book. Feeling they need to bring the rumor even home more forcefully, they go on. The physical type of the American Indian is Mongoloid, being more closely related to that of the peoples of Eastern, Central, and Northeastern Asia. Archaeological evidence indicates that the ancestors of the present Indians came into the New World probably over a land bridge known to have existed in the Bering Strait region during the last ice age, in a continuous series of small migrations beginning from about 25,000 to 30,000 years ago. Present evidence indicates that the first people to reach this continent from the east were the Norsemen, who briefly visited the northeastern part of North America around AD 1000 and then settled in Greenland. There is nothing to show that they reached Mexico or Central America. American Indians had no wheat, barley, oats, millet, rice, cattle, pigs, chickens, horses, donkeys, or camels before 1492. Camels and horses were in the Americas, along with mammoth, mastodon, but all of these animals became extinct around 10,000 BC, at the time when the early big game hunters spread across the Americas. Iron, steel, glass, and silk were not used in the New World before 1492, with the exception of the occasional use of unsmelted meteoric iron. Native copper was worked in various locations in pre-Columbian times, but true metallurgy was limited to southern Mexico and the Andean region, where the occurrence in late prehistoric times involved gold, silver, copper, and their alloys, but not iron. No reputable Egyptologist or any expert on New World archaeology or anthropology, and no expert on New World prehistory has discovered or confirmed any relationship between archaeological remains in Mexico and archaeological remains in Egypt. Likewise, the National Geographic Society distanced itself from the Book of Mormon by responding to queries they received, as detailed in this one letter below. And this is dated January the 11th, 1990. Dear Mr. Larson, thank you for writing to the National Geographic Society. The Society has never used the Book of Mormon to locate archaeological sites, and we do not believe that any of the places named in the Book of Mormon can be placed geographically by evidence of archaeology. So far as we know, there is no archaeological evidence to verify the history of early peoples of the Western Hemisphere as presented in the Book of Mormon. I hope that you'll find this information useful, and this is signed Pamela Tucci, Research Correspondent. The following are statements from leaders in the field of pre-Columbian archaeology and pre-Columbian anthropology, as well as Egyptology. And I'm quoting now Rich Blatton, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Purdue University. I'm not familiar with the Book of Mormon in detail, but from what you indicate about its contents, it's totally made up. There's absolutely no evidence of any of this, not to mention implicitly racist, because it seems to imply that the Native Americans lack the ability to build civilizations without the help of the Lamanites. David Carrasco, professor of the study of Latin America at Harvard Divinity School, writes, all historical and archaeological evidence contradicts the Book of Mormon's stories of the peopling of the Americas and early history of Native American societies. The Book of Mormon is a work of faith and naturally has credibility to the faithful, but it has no historical basis any more than the Book of Genesis is a historically or scientifically accurate version of the origin of the earth and human beings. However, much of it, or the Book of Mormon, may serve as a moral guide to believers. And I'm sure you can understand why people might be uncomfortable directly contradicting the teachings of what has become a very well-established religious movement. The vast majority of scientists who have examined North, South, and Central American migration have concluded that the Americas were peopled by immigrants from Asia, probably 15,000 years ago, give or take some thousands. This is borne out by archaeology as well as genetic evidence, DNA, blood types, and other factors. Their descendants settled throughout the entire New World. Complex urban civilizations developed in Mexico and Central America, in isolation from the rest of the world, out of the accumulated knowledge of people who lived there for thousands of years, domesticated corn and other food groups and crops, and learned very well how to live in those environments. Languages of the New World bear no relationship to Hebrew. Ever since Europeans became aware of North America, there has been various attempts to identify them as the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel, mentioned in the Old Testament. So we might say that Joseph Smith's version was to some degree a variation of this old theme. Louise Burkhardt, professor of anthropology at the University at Albany, says, "The Book of Mormon is a book of faith and storytelling and not history. Historically, it is inaccurate. If we go on archaeological evidence, there's no basis for what the Book of Mormon teaches." Here's another point. People of faith believe what they want to believe about the authenticity of their own religion. Some Catholics believe that St. Thomas, one of Jesus Christ's disciples, migrated to Mexico after the crucifixion and preached in Mexico. This is because they found some parallels between Aztec and Mayan religions and the Bible. But there is not one single fact, datum, object, or word that supports either the Mormon view or the Catholic view. Brigham H. Roberts, March 13, 1857 to September 27, 1933, was a general authority in the Mormon Church, a historian, politician, and polygamist. He published a 6-volume history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and also wrote studies of the Book of Mormon, which was published posthumously, in which he concluded that there was no linguistic evidence found among the North American peoples supporting the Book of Mormon narrative. Roberts showed that the different language stocks and dialects would not have had enough time to develop from a single language dating back to just AD 400. He notes the facts developed up to this point seem to be that there are large numbers of separate language stocks in America that show no relationship to each other. It would take a long time, much longer than that recognized as historic times, to develop these dialects and stocks where the development is conceived of as arising from a common source of origin, some primitive language. There is no connection between the American languages and the languages of the people of the Old World. New World languages appear to be indigenous to the New World. The time limits named in the Book of Mormon, which represent the people of America as speaking and writing one language down to as late as the period of 400 AD, is not sufficient to allow for the divergencies into the American language stocks and their dialects. While Roberts, some would tell you, maintained his belief in the Mormon Church, in Book of Mormon Difficulties, a study written in response to a series of questions put to him by Church President Heber J. Grant, he confessed that he had no answers to many of these difficulties. Interestingly, in his text entitled A Book of Mormon Study, Roberts compares the Book of Mormon to the earlier published View of the Hebrews, written by Ethan Smith, and found significant similarities between them. Roberts wrote in a parallel, a condensed version of his more extensive study, which demonstrated 18 points of similarity between the two books, and in which he entertained the genuine possibility that the creative Joseph Smith might very well have written the Book of Mormon without any divine assistance. His study, as one might imagine, did anything but endear him to the church leadership, and it's now been shown that Roberts withheld much of his evidence and discoveries from the general authorities of his day because of their resistance to hearing anything that did not support the church's claims. As Richard and Joan Osling have discovered, Roberts declared that the validity of the Mormon Church must stand or fall on the truth of Joseph Smith's claim that the Book of Mormon was the historical record of an ancient people inscribed on golden plates. They also found that he predicted, somewhat prophetically, that if the church leadership does not address the problems about its origin and many of the anachronisms found within the Book of Mormon, these difficulties would eventually undermine the faith of the youth of the church. It's interesting that as I write this, almost 100 years after Roberts did his analysis, the LDS Church has yet to address the many problems he outlined. However, now in the age of the Internet, it's coming home to roost. The Book of Mormon also claims that the ancient inhabitants of the Americas spoke and wrote in Reformed Egyptian and Hebrew. However, as the Smithsonian's 8th statement regarding the Book of Mormon states, reports of findings of ancient Egyptian, Hebrew, or other Old World writings in the New World in pre-Columbian contexts have frequently appeared in newspapers, magazines, and sensational books. None of these claims has stood up to the examination by reputable scholars. No inscriptions using Old World forms of writing have been shown to have occurred in any part of the Americas before 1492, except for a few Norse rune stories which have been found in Greenland. Absent any archaeological or anthropological evidence supporting the Book of Mormon, the Church's apologists have made the following statement. The Book of Mormon mentions cities, trade, warfare, towers, and the use of armor, all of which did exist in ancient America. Yet, their existence has not convinced critics that the Book of Mormon is an authentic ancient text. Hold on. All of which did exist in the ancient Americas? I'm anxious to learn more about these discoveries, these cities that Fair Mormon mentions, and view the evidence of warfare, towers, and armor. My professor and mentor when I was a graduate student, and later my colleague when I taught at the University of Alberta, Dr. A.G. Peroni, spent years researching the trade routes of the early Florentine merchants. So I'm a little familiar with ancient trade. There is no evidence of such trade in the Book of Mormon. The Fair Mormon apologists provide no evidence of the existence of trade, warfare, towers, and the use of armor, just an assertion. Nor do they comment on my statement regarding the absence of chariots or skeletal remains of the millions of soldiers who reportedly died in battle, or the total absence of the Hebrew language. Reading the remainder of this article, I discovered that Fair Mormon fails to provide any specifics, let alone evidence. They do a lot of dancing around epigraphic and iconographic evidence, but they do not provide anything worthwhile, nor have they assailed in any way the myriad statements made by legitimate archaeologists that there is absolutely no archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. Fair Mormon makes statements such as, there is plenty of supporting evidence that anthropologically ties the Book of Mormon to ancient America, but again, nothing beyond their assertion. This is one of their favorite dishonest apologetic techniques, the presupposition. And sadly, many people fall for it. The simple truth is there is no evidence, period. I understand the Church's dilemma, but deception and sophistry doesn't cut it. The assertion that there is plenty of supporting evidence is just not true. And the only archaeologists who might make such a claim are trying to weave straw into gold down at BYU. If the evidence does exist, in the words of Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady, don't talk at all, show me. Joseph Fielding Smith hangs an even more bizarre explanation out there. He suggests that the reason we can't find any archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon is that God is hiding it. And I quote him, "It's the opinion of the writer that the Lord does not intend that the Book of Mormon, at least at present, shall be proved true by archaeological findings. The day may come when such is the case, but not now. The Book of Mormon is itself a witness to the truth, and the promise has been given most solemnly that any person who will read it with a prayerful heart may receive the abiding testimony of its truth." I would contend that if the Church had even one item, a chariot, a sword, a Hebrew inscription, they would be crowing about it. Look at all the buzz that they generated over the discovery of an altar inscribed with the letters NHM that I'll discuss later. Instead, they produce misinformation like this, and I'm quoting, "Those who make claims that there's no archaeological evidence supporting the Book of Mormon are right in one respect. We don't know where the cities mentioned in the Book of Mormon are located. Such information may yet be discovered, but not discovering it is just as likely given the lack of cultural continuity, as well as the epigraphic and iconographic uncertainties. To dismiss the Book of Mormon on archaeological grounds is short-sighted, as continuing discoveries provide even more evidence that is consistent with the book. Archaeology is not a dead science, and it continues to make new inroads that are applicable to Book of Mormon studies. I've highlighted 3 false and/or misleading statements in this one paragraph alone. Continuing discoveries. There's been no discoveries, continuing or otherwise. Think not? Next time you go to Salt Lake City, go to the LDS Church History Museum and ask the lovely young lady behind the information desk on what floor you can find the Nephi artifacts. Even more evidence that is consistent with the book. Again, forgive me, but I have to call bullshit here. Before you can say even more, you have to have some. That's the way things work in the real world. Continue to make new inroads. An inroad is defined as an advance or penetration. What advances or penetrations have the Mormon archaeologists made? This type of hit-and-run, unsubstantiated evidentiary blether is meaningless and solely intended to mislead the unschooled, and should be recognized as such. I believe any intelligent man or woman, let alone a critical thinker, can see the dishonesty of the Church's apologetic techniques. In the February 2001 edition of the Ensign magazine, a short article entitled Book of Mormon linked to a site in Yemen covers the story of a rock or altar found in Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula, which the article states had the word Nahum inscribed upon it. This was touted as a monumental discovery, as the name is associated with Lehi's journey as recorded in the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi 16:34, which reads, "And it came to pass that Ishmael died, and was buried in the place which was called Nahum." Finally, a shred of evidence, well, at least something, although not found in the Americas. That would be something truly impressive. The Ensign article goes on to say that professional archaeologists have dated it to 700 BC, so the timing is right. The author of the article was a little zealous, however. The stone or altar did not have Nahum inscribed upon it, just the 3 consonants N, H, and M. Nevertheless, since vowels are not used in Hebrew writing, Nahum is a distinct possibility. It is also important to note that Nihm is believed to be the tribal name rather than the place name, and that the 3 consonants could have a variety of spellings when vowels are inserted. Nihm, Naham, Nahm, Nahem, etc. Nevertheless, it is certainly reasonable to surmise that the tribe gave its name to the region where they lived. The discovery is interesting. This discovery is very interesting and may, in fact, be significant, although hardly a slam dunk. John Hamer, who has written on several topics related to LDS history, does not share the Ensign's enthusiasm, and I quote him, "Although some apologists have described the odds that this Nahum, NHM correlation is astronomical, it hardly rises to the level of notable coincidence. The Book of Mormon derives its names from a book that has Semitic origins and sources, the King James Bible. Many of the names in the Book of Mormon are just plucked directly from the Bible. For example, Lehi from Judges 25:19, Laban from Genesis 24:30, Lemuel from Proverbs 31. Other names, however, use the Bible as their inspiration, with alterations. For example, Jeram for Jeram, 2 Samuel, Omni from Omri, 1 Kings 16, Nahor from Nahor, Genesis 11. Nahum easily fits into the following category, or the latter category. Nahum is a book of the Old Testament, Nahum. Fair Mormon contends that NHM in Yemen must be Nahum because other details fit. However, there are at least 3 cities or streets with NHM name patterns in Israel and at least 1 in Iraq. For that matter, we have Anaheim in California. I also find it curious that Lehi and the gang were erecting inscribed monuments when crossing Arabia, but seem to have given up on the practice entirely upon reaching America. It would be great if more, and much more impressive, if we were to uncover a monument, or anything else for that matter, with a Hebrew inscription this side of the ocean. The more we learn about pre-Columbian history and the Americas, the more difficult it becomes to accept Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon tale. Fair Mormon's response to my interrogatory number 1. Fair responds to my online comments on the dearth of any archaeological or anthropological evidence by accusing me of providing propaganda or spin. They state, simply repeating assertions by ex-Mormons and critics of the Church that there is no evidence of the Book of Mormon does not make their assertions true. Those who look for such evidence can find it. I fail to see how questioning why, during the past 600 years, we have not found any archaeological, anthropological, or linguistic evidence to support the Book of Mormon narrative can be characterized as propaganda or spin. Nor is it accurate to characterize non-Mormon archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians who have no skin in the game as critics of the Church. Fair Mormon would suggest that the only people indicating that there's a dearth of archaeological evidence are ex-Mormons and critics of the Church. This is absolute nonsense. Would Michael Coe, renowned Yale expert on the Mayans, be in their view a critic of the Church? I presented comments from noted experts, both Mormon and non-Mormon alike, to substantiate my assertions. Fair says repeating the assertions that there's no evidence of the Book of Mormon does not make the assertions true. I agree, but neither does it make it false. Fair may be tired of hearing it, nevertheless it remains an important question, needing to be addressed, which to date it has not. And here we go again. Fairmorn says, those who look for such evidence can find it. I've been looking for many years and have been unable to find it, both in and outside of the Church. Can we have some specifics? Please, Fair Mormon, unless this is some type of ecclesiastical scavenger hunt, show us where we can find the evidence of which you speak. I would submit that Fair Mormon, or more to the point, the Mormon Church's failure to provide any affirmative evidence, must lead any reasonable person to conclude that they simply have none. Rather than throwing out assertions like, there is much evidence, why not present that evidence so that we can test and evaluate it? Fair then goes on to suggest that it's the questioner's lack of knowledge about a very specialized academic area that's really the problem. They imply that if you're not yourself an archaeologist, you're too ignorant to grasp the sublime subtleties of that science. What nonsense! And finally, in a shocking display of their ignorance of both logic and philosophy, Fair moves next to that old chestnut. The absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. I've heard many wide-eyed Latter-day Saint missionaries repeat this. However, while cute, this silly little maxim negates the importance of evidence with a negative value. A null result is equivalent to evidence of absence and can be used to deduce or infer that the non-existence of something is real. If, for example, a physician during an exploratory surgery does not find a malignant tumor or any malignant cells within a patient, this represents a null result, finding nothing, and is evidence of the absence of cancer, even though the surgeon did not detect anything per se. Such inductive reasoning is essential in the world of science and to critical thinking. Unsubstantiated claims and statements such as newer archaeological finds are generally consistent with the Book of Mormon record, even if unable as yet to know where the exact location of the Book of Mormon cities fall, are meaningless absence examples of such. Where are these newer archaeological finds? It's all a mist, a vapor. There's no substance to the Church's claims. Come on, Fair. I've shown you mine, now show me yours. Fair Mormon next goes on to state, why would a non-Mormon archaeologist, anthropologist, or linguist have any interest in searching for any evidence providing proof of the Book of Mormon? It should be obvious that any archaeologist, anthropologist, or linguist interested in the subject must themselves or would themselves be Mormon. I'm sorry, and I'm trying hard not to be snarky, but this is an incredibly stupid thing to say. By Fair's reasoning, then, it should be obvious that any historian interested in the Third Reich must be a Nazi, or anyone studying serial killers would themselves be one. Which Fair Mormon scribbler penned this piece of brilliant apologetics? Archaeologists, anthropologists, and or linguists need not be searching for evidence proving or disproving the Book of Mormon's authenticity. The fact that their extensive research has not discovered any evidence consistent with, or even in a tangential way supportive of the Book of Mormon narrative speaks volumes. Agreed, most non-Mormon archaeologists, anthropologists, and or linguists likely haven't given much thought to the Book of Mormon or its claims because it's irrelevant and of little import to their serious work. Nevertheless, as the above has shown, those who have been asked to comment on the Book of Mormon are not remotely supportive or consistent with its findings in terms of actual real archaeology or anthropology. Fair Mormon apologists just don't seem to get it. The scholars I've referenced have no skin in the game. Unlike Mormon archaeologists, they don't have a theological axe to grind. Their agenda is neither to defend nor to attack the Book of Mormon. They're simply looking at data, and those data just do not fit Smith's Book of Mormon tale. Fair Mormon also takes umbrage at my reference to the work of Thomas Stewart Ferguson, a faithful member of the church who was honest enough to write, "You can't set the Book of Mormon geographically down anywhere because it's fictional." Their concern, it would seem, is that Ferguson never studied archaeology at a professional level. They quote John Sorensen, a BYU archaeologist, to make their point. As John Sorensen, who worked with Ferguson, recalls, Stan Larson implied that Ferguson was one of the scholars and intellectuals in the church, and that his study was conducted along the lines of reliable scholarship in the field of archaeology. Those of us who personally had experience with Ferguson and his thinking knew differently. Stan Larson implied that Ferguson was one of the scholars and intellectuals in the church, and that his study was conducted along the lines of reliable scholarship in the field of archaeology. Those of us who personally had experience with Ferguson and his thinking knew differently. He held an undergraduate law degree, but never studied archaeology or any related discipline at a professional level. Ferguson was never an expert on archaeology or the Book of Mormon. He was not one whose careful study led him to greater light that would free him from Latter-day Saint dogma as Larson represents. Instead, he was just a layman, initially enthusiastic and hopeful, but eventually trapped by his unjustified expectations, flawed logic, limited information, perhaps offended pride, and lack of faith in the tedious research that real scholarship requires. The negative arguments he used against the Latter-day Saint Church scriptures in his last years display all of these weaknesses. I would contend, however, that there's no reason to throw Brother Ferguson under the bus. Finally, I never said that he was an archaeologist, but rather that Thomas Stewart Ferguson was a faithful member of the church who in 1952 single-handedly founded the New World Archaeological Foundation. Secondly, the church obviously saw some value in his work, insofar as they funded it twice. NWAF received $15,000 from the First Presidency in 1953, with the strict provision that there was to be absolutely no publicity. In 1955, the First Presidency pledged another $200,000 to NWAF to sponsor additional years of fieldwork. $200,000 was a lot of money in 1950. If the point that Fair Mormon is trying to make is that because Thomas Ferguson was not a professional archaeologist, his work lacks credibility, let me quote from an article written by LDS apologist Dan Peterson, who confirms that while Ferguson himself was not an archaeologist, NWAF was staffed by professional archaeologists. Several relevant facts stand out from the bare-bones recital of the earliest history of the New World Archaeological Foundation. First, non-Latter-day Saint archaeologists were prominent, in fact dominant, from the beginning, choosing central Chiapas as the geographical focus of excavations. Second, Fair Mormon's choice of John Sorensen as the respected archaeologist to make their point is unwise. In a blistering review of Sorensen's lack of scholarship and questionable referencing, author and Mormon Bishop Del Dowdell commented on the stuff Sorensen was publishing in several Mormon publications. John L. Sorensen, in his book An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, writes the earliest place so far probably dates to around the 1st century BC. It's a bit of copper sheathing found on top of an altar at Colculco in the Valley of Mexico. However, a search of his references and allied articles turns up no such piece. There is a single mention of copper, such as copper rattles found in Mexico, dating to the post-classic period, which is after 1000 AD. Sorensen also wrote, there have been proven to be several hundred such specimens, dating from 400 BC to 900 AD, 153 of which were excavated by professional archaeologists, referencing, you guessed it, his own work. Sorensen's most quoted reference is himself, Indeed, he's often the only reference source regarding his theories on Book of Mormon metallurgy in Mesoamerica. As an example, in an article entitled Metals and Weapons in the Book of Mormon, Sorensen references himself 27 times as a source of information regarding metals in Mesoamerica. Dowdell comments further, and I'm quoting him, "Since Sorensen is neither a metallurgist nor one who has searched ancient sites and digs looking for artifacts and evidence of metal in ancient America, there is no possible way he should be the source material for proof that metallurgy existed in ancient America. Such ludicrous sourcing and citing are neither scholarly nor helpful, and it certainly is not suggestive to critics of the Church and the Book of Mormon that any written material with such referencing is either accurate or honest." I've expressed caution previously regarding the level and quality of scholarship at BYU, at least in the field of archaeology and anthropology. Sorensen was professor of anthropology at Brigham Young University for well over 50 years. He had immersed himself in Book of Mormon archaeology. Yet searching the three big, peer-reviewed scholarly journals on anthropology and archaeology in the United States online, not one article by John L. Sorensen shows up, not in the American Journal of Archaeology or in the journals of the American Anthropological Association or the Archaeological Institute of America. Let me repeat that. In 50 years as a professor of archaeology at BYU, not a single peer-reviewed article. It's an understatement to say that BYU is not the place to study archaeology. If you ever hope to work anywhere other than at Brigham Young University or some lesser Mormon college, the BYU Archaeology Department has a unique and dubious distinction of having had its excavation license revoked by the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry for disseminating inaccurate findings. The Egyptian Antiquities Ministry was outraged by BYU's team leader Kerry Mulstein's publication in the newspaper, speaking of mummies, that we are fairly certain we have over 1 million burials within this cemetery. It's large and it's dense. Not only did Mulstein grossly exaggerate the number of what he thought were mummies, but the ministry had to explain to this BYU archaeologist what a mummy is. Not one of the millions Mulstein claimed to have discovered, in fact, was a mummy. Yosef Khalifa, the head of the ancient Egyptian department, said, "What BYU published in the newspaper is not true. A mummy, by definition to begin with, means a complete mummified body, and there is only one mummy found at the site back in 1980, and not by BYU, which is at the Egyptian Museum since then." He added, describing the bodies at the site as only poor skeletons and plenty of bones, some of which were wrapped in textiles. Generations of amateur Mormon archaeologists have written books containing photographs of ancient ruins and artifacts advancing the claim that these things prove that the Book of Mormon is true. These findings, however, can be summarized as wrong time, wrong place, wrong people. Sadly, the Church has knowingly provided, and possibly continues to provide, young missionaries with archaeological slides of Mayan temples and ruins, which can mislead investigators, trying in some, as I've already noted, there have been tens of thousands of archaeological finds that support the Bible, including many biblical empires, cities, sites, artifacts, weapons, coins, and much more. Coins mentioned in the Bible have been found in abundance, such as the widow's mite or denarius that I hold in my hand. Perhaps the greatest single discovery confirming the Bible's historicity was the Dead Sea Scrolls, first discovered by Bedouins in the caves of Qumran in 1947. Excavations initially led by Roland de Fox discovered some 800 documents in tens of thousands of fragments, written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They contained biblical apocalyptic works, prayers, as well as legal texts and secular documents. Biblical archaeologists have also unearthed a stratum of burnt material containing the remains of the walls of Jericho, which were destroyed either by earthquake or a siege. Many fields of study span the Bible's history, from archaeology to astronomy, to linguistics, to comparative literature. Israel's enemies have been well documented and are solidly historical. In short, The historicity of the Bible is absolutely beyond question. The Holy Bible has been collaborated historically, geographically, archaeologically, and linguistically, and both its translation and transmission have been verified by literally thousands of ancient documents. The fact that Jesus repeatedly quoted the Old Testament with confidence and without any suggestion that it was corrupt should be reason enough for us to accept that it's the Word of God. The New Testament has also been proven to be unchanged and undefiled. Some critical of the extensiveness of the Bible's cities have stated that only 262 have been identified with any degree of certainty. If 262 cities or places in the Book of Mormon had been identified with any degree of certainty, we might witness Russell Nelson doing an Irish jig on the dome of the tabernacle. The fly page of the Book of Mormon, before it was quietly changed, speaks of the principal ancestors of the American Indians. And a little further in, it tells us, "And it is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. For behold, many nations would overrun the land, and there would be no place for an inheritance." That was 2 Nephi. Also we have the words of those who one might think would know. "We therefore cast a glance southward into old Mexico and through the great countries beyond, down through Central America and South America, where there are millions and millions of Lamanites, direct descendants of Father Lehi." And that was Elder Andrew Jensen, speaking at conference in 1921. Spencer W. Kimball said, "About 25 centuries ago, a hardy group left the comforts of a great city, crossed a desert, braved an ocean, and came to the shores of this, their promised land. There were two large families, those of Lehi and Ishmael, who in a couple of centuries numbered hundreds of millions of people on these two American continents." The suggestion of Mormon apologists that the research findings of archaeologists such as Yale University's Dr. Michael Coe would be different if he could just assume that the Nephites really did exist. This, of course, runs in the face of the scientific method. The starting point is not assumptions and conclusions. Those come later after the data has been studied and examined. Respected Mormon archaeologist William J. Hamlin asks, "Why do non-Mormon scholars reject the Book of Mormon?" He then goes on to answer his own question. Acceptance of the historicity of the Book of Mormon logically necessitates recognition then of Joseph Smith's pathetic claims that any scholar who eventually comes to accept the historicity of the Book of Mormon would be logically compelled to become a Latter-day Saint. Is Hamlin suggesting that there's some unstated conspiracy amongst scholars to avoid the siren call of the Book of Mormon? For if they tasted sweet nectar of truth, they would have to become Mormons. Now that's pushing a cognitive dissonance proposition to its limits. But he continues. Next, he laments the fact that most non-Mormons do not take the Book of Mormon seriously enough, even to read it, let alone give it the careful study required to make an informed judgment. Fair Mormon and forums before it have stated that there is much archaeological proof to the Book of Mormon. This is a falsehood. Professor Paul E. Minnis from the University of Oklahoma's Department of Archaeology reflects the learned belief of dispassionate experts in pre-Columbian America that it is safe to say that few, if any, professional archaeologists, except those who are practicing Mormons themselves, view the Book of Mormon as a document with any archaeological value. And again, the late Dr. Michael Coe, an expert on Mesoamerica, has stated that the bare facts are that nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever shown up in the New World excavations that would suggest to a dispassionate observer that the Book of Mormon, as claimed by Joseph Smith, is a historical document relating to the history of early migrants to this hemisphere. I would suggest that a reasonable person would agree that Fair's rebuttal to what I've written here earns them an F. Therefore, President Uchtdorf, I stand by my contention that there is no compelling evidence that any legitimate non-Mormon archaeologist could point to that supports the validity of the Book of Mormon. None, nine, dainonin. Well, this concludes today's episode. Please join us next week when we continue our journey. Until then, this is Paul Douglas wishing you all the very best.